I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. Tonight's webinar is going to be the last part of the four-part series that we've been doing on hitting. This has been essentially a very basic overview of hitting, but we've hit on some pretty key elements, evaluating our hitters. First off, lower body mechanics, core mechanics last week, and then this week we're going to talk about arms and bat dynamics to kind of round out the four-part series. So we're going to go ahead and get right to it. If you have questions, I have people on mute, so if you have questions, type the questions into the chat bar, and as they come up, I will read them out loud and answer them. If we really need to turn on a microphone, we can turn on a microphone, but I tend to keep everyone muted just so that we can avoid all the background chatter and some of the feedback that happens as we go through this process. So we're going to go ahead and get right to it with respect to upper body dynamics. Tonight, as a basic overview, we're going to, as we have the last 3 weeks, talk about goals for developing an effective swing training program, structure and progression. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but we'll definitely touch base on them as we have, really to begin each of the webinars, because it's very important to understand how it is we're using this technology and how it is we're using this data and this information to create effective training programs. Analysis, data, technology in general, analysis, data, evaluation, if you will, is only as good as what you can do with it, in my opinion. And so we want to talk about what it is that we're trying to evaluate based on what it is we're trying to accomplish. So understanding the structure, the goals, the structure, and the progression behind developing an effective training program is absolutely key. We will then talk about our upper body, or what we might refer to as fling mechanics, and I'll explain why we throw that word fling in there. But we're going to talk about it from an anatomical or functional perspective as well as a swing biomechanics perspective. Then we're going to get into just really basically how we want to create structure and perspective for specifically an upper body program. From there, we're going to talk about a very basic program. We'll talk about how we can advance these programs, and eventually we'll, at the end, talk a little bit about how we can add other types of components into the mix to really round out what it is we're trying to accomplish. Where really the main goal of this is swing coordination or activity-specific function. We can add other components to augment that process of developing new patterns, creating new patterns, and improving swing performance through better coordination and better application of physical attribute towards the activity that we are undertaking, in this case, obviously, baseball swing. So that's our overview for this evening. So we'll get right to it and see if we can't get through this in a timely fashion so that there's some time at the end for questions if need be. So again, these are things that we've covered pretty much every week, but they're worth preempting each of these, or sort of prefacing each of these segments that we're doing. The first is goal, having a goal. So when you're looking at a hitter, when you're looking at an athlete in general, relative to some sort of activity, you need to have some sort of clear-cut, definable, focused reason for training. You have to have some goal, and that goal has to come out of some sort of evaluation process. So there has to be some sort of assimilation of information. That can be as simple as watching a hitter. It can be a little more involved in terms of maybe video or high-speed video or some sort of 2D qualitative/quantitative assessment, or as advanced as a Xenolink product or something like a Xenolink product where we're looking at three-dimensional biomechanics. But there has to be some sort of evaluation process that leads to analysis of information, which then lends itself to the ability to define an issue or a problem, and as a result of that, define an outcome, define some goal with which we are going to enter into our training and enter into this whole training process. The goal is the most important thing, the ability to create a clear-cut, definable, focused reason for training with some sort of definable outcome as a function of our training. Absolutely critical. After we've defined the goal As critical as a structure. We have to have some sort of plan. We have to be able to get from point A to point B. So we have some issues. We've defined those issues through our evaluation / analysis process. And now we need to do something. We have a goal. We have an outcome, a definable outcome. We now have to have a plan to get from where we are at to what our definable outcome is based on that goal process. The structure, the plan, does not have to be rigid. It can be fluid. In fact, it should be fluid. It can be shell-like, which with focus, with structure as its primary sort of emphasis, but it can have flexibility in that once we get into a program, we adjust based on how an individual responds to the training that we are applying. After we've defined these goals, after we've developed a structure for attaining those goals, we have to include some sort of progression. And the two ways that we want to look at creating progression, number one, starting with very small digestible parts, and then eventually adding those parts into more complex movements, and then eventually adding speed or any of the other more intensity level stuff, whether it be speed or power or force. So we want, very simply, to create a program in a structure, getting us from point A to point B based on our goals, that has very definable, very digestible components that can be monitored, that can be learned simply, and then added together to create more complexity, more complex movement, and then eventually adding the last bit of function into it. As a function of that, though, we have to have some sort of systematic escalation or increase in the challenge and demand. So if we do the same thing over and over and over again, the body, the nervous system, the brain, however you want to look at it, even just the tissues itself, the musculoskeletal system, will become somewhat complacent about evolving. So we have to continuously cycle through a systematic escalation or increase in the challenge. Now, we don't want a linear increase. We want more of a spiraling. So we want a circular concept of driving through. In other words, it's a periodization model. We want to drive through certain sequences with the idea that we're not just coming around full circle, but we're advancing. At the same time, we are sort of reiterating certain components over and over again. So your conditioning base, your strength power base, your speed, skill, acquisition base. And as those things progress and evolve, you get more of a spiral rather than just a linear or a circular type of evolution. So again, we want small digestible parts that can be then mastered and then added together for more complexity. At the end of a cycle, adding the skill component, the speed, the power, the strength, the force, whatever might be required by the actual activity. And we want to systematically increase the challenge and demands as we move through this process. All right, let's get to anatomical here. With respect to the extremities, there's some basic stuff that we should have an understanding of. The key ones are going to be shoulder movement, in particular relative to hitting, elbow movement, and then forearm movement. Of course, there's wrist movement, and there are a lot of variations of shoulder movement, or not variations, but components of shoulder movement. We're going to focus on a few key ones. The first thing to look at here is with respect to the elbow. Very simply, the elbow goes through a process of elbow extension and elbow flexion. Elbow extension would be as the upper arm moves away from, as the lower arm moves away from the upper arm. That would be extension, okay? Flexion would be as the lower arm moves towards the upper arm. So if you can think of it, extension, that's why we call it tricep extension, if you're familiar with the very basic exercise like a tricep extension. As the triceps are engaged and the lower arm moves away from the upper arm, or the forearm moves away from the humerus, we get extension. As the bicep is engaged and we move our lower arm towards our upper arm, we get flexion. And that's important to understand that component of the movement. With respect to shoulder, Now there are movements at the shoulder with the shoulder or upper arm relative to the midline. We call it abduction, adduction, or flexion, extension, depending on where the upper arm is. We can also talk about horizontal movement, horizontal abduction, adduction, and those are all important components. But probably the most important of the combination of things is going to be internal, external rotation. So external rotation is as the upper arm moves in this backward motion or anterior, from anterior to posterior about the axis of the humerus. Internal rotation is as the upper arm, or I should say the lower arm here, the forearm, moves in a motion that is towards the anterior, towards the front of the body, around, again, the axis of the rotation of the humerus. So this is external rotation, and this is internal rotation. Again, the shoulder is a complex joint and has quite a bit of range of motion. We're going to be most focused on the external, internal rotation. When we look at our forearm, again, there's a lot of range of motion going on here, and then when you add in the wrist, it becomes fairly complicated. But let's just talk about the basic movements of the forearm itself. And these are movements that really are originating in the middle of the forearm with respect to the bones and moving the hand. So in neutral, we've got the thumb straight up and down, sort of in line with the upper arm and the bicep. If we roll the thumb open, we go into supination, palm up. If we roll the thumb down, palm down, we are going into pronation. So we've got supination and we've got pronation about the axis of the forearm relative to moving essentially, if you think of the thumb, either open or up where the palm is opening, or upward or downward where the palm is closing. So we've got our ranges of motion that are most critical to the things that we're going to be talking about from the anatomical perspective. We've got our elbow, flexion, extension, and we've got our shoulder, internal, external rotation. And then we've got our forearm, supination, pronation. And those are really the key ones that we want to look at. Certainly, there are other aspects of the shoulder and of the wrist and hand that play a role. But these are our primary ones. These are our most important ones, and these are the ones we want to focus on. So from an anatomical perspective, pretty straightforward: elbow flexion, extension, shoulder internal, external rotation, and forearm supination, pronation. So with respect to anatomical and these motions, what I want to discuss here briefly is this idea that these motions are linked together. Okay. Now this is a motion we call shoulder or extremity D1, D2. So a diagonal D1, diagonal D2, or diagonal 1, diagonal 2. This involves a squat. It doesn't have to involve a squat. But what we're really going through is, if we look at the right arm in particular, we see that the right arm is in a position of elbow flexion and external rotation. As the arm comes across the body diagonally, we will get elbow extension combined with internal rotation, and those two motions will be combined with supination, pronation. So in this case, we're getting our supination, and as we move diagonally downward, we're going to add pronation. So these motions are linked together neuromechanically. It's important to understand that, and you can see the correlation to where a batter starts and where a batter finishes. So what you have here is, and again, you've got other components, the shoulder and whatnot, but really what we're looking at is external rotation combined with elbow flexion combined with forearm supination. Now, as the arm moves diagonally across the body, so as if you were swinging a baseball bat, you will see that the shoulder goes into an internal rotation, elbow flexion, or elbow extension, and wrist pronation. So here you had external rotation, flexion, supination. Here you have internal rotation, extension, pronation. These are linked together, and it's important to understand that they happen simultaneously in an effective movement. These movements are used for training. They are used for physical therapy purposes, and the reason that they are is that they're neuromechanically linked and that they are present in all of the functional activities that we perform. So what I want to look at here is, although we're talking about baseball swing, it's important to understand that these are linked together for all of our swing throw patterns. And here I'm just bringing up a couple different ones. Here's a tennis serve. So as you look here and you watch the tennis serve or athlete go into their load action, you'll see exactly what I just showed you. So this is a tennis serve, but you're seeing external rotation, elbow flexion, and wrist or forearm supination. As the arm is accelerated into collision, you're getting internal rotation, you're getting elbow extension, and you're getting wrist or forearm pronation. And then it continues on, and then obviously you've got your deceleration, and the mechanism then kind of repeats itself. But the point of this is that it's not just a hitting movement, it's an overall anatomically based swing throw kind of pattern. So it's important to understand that in all these activities, whether it's single arm or double arm, single arm being a swing action, double arm being a throw action, reverse. Single arm being a throw action, double arm being a swing action, that this pattern occurs over and over again. And not only does it occur as a part of these patterns, but it's really neuromechanically almost ingrained in our nervous system to link these patterns together in the sequences that I'm showing you. So I'll just show you one more. Let's get to baseball. I'm not into hitting yet. But even a baseball throw, you can see here, here's the left-hand picture, you're going to go into, as you move into from picture 1 to picture 2, you're going into the load mechanism, you're getting elbow flexion, you're getting external rotation, and you're getting wrist supination or forearm supination. As you accelerate, you are internally rotating, you are extending at the elbow, and you are pronating at the forearm. So again, this is the point of this is to make sure that you understand that this linkage of the upper extremity movement is something that is essentially a part of all of our swing throw patterns. So it's not just hitting, which is important to understand. And they are, to some degree, biomechanically, neuromechanically ingrained in our nervous system, ingrained in our body as a function of movement. Now, the only thing I'll mention is that when we hit in a hitting or swinging type of action, where two arms are attached to an implement as opposed to one arm with an implement like a baseball pitch or a tennis serve, that the opposite arm will go through the opposite D1, D2 pattern or the opposite shoulder, elbow, forearm pattern. So when the arms are linked together, if one arm is going through an extension, through a external rotation, flexion, supination pattern, the opposite arm attached to, say, for example, the baseball bat would be going through the opposite pattern. So in that case, you have shoulder internal rotation, elbow extension, and forearm pronation. So you're going to get the opposite occurring. So you have essentially, for the most part, especially when you go through the diagonal pattern, you're going to have equal and opposite actions when two arms are attached to an implement in a swing up type pattern. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the biomechanics before we get into the PST stuff. From a biomechanics perspective, we talked about primary drivers. Okay, primary drivers boil down to the key areas in which fairly complex biomechanics are going on to drive this process. Initially, obviously, we talked about overall evaluation, but then we immediately got into lower body. We talked about core last week, and now we're talking about the last part of that, and that's our upper body, or what we refer to as flinging. The primary drivers, you can think of this whole process to some degree as a car, in that the lower body is our horsepower, the core becomes our differential, and the upper body really becomes the outcome. And so the outcome is not doing the work, but the outcome is benefiting from the work. So it's very important to understand that, because in many swing patterns, especially in this day and age, with respect to the equipment itself, the bats, the lightness of the bats, the materials that they're using in the bats, and also a lot of the mechanics that are being taught these days, the upper body tends to do work, quite a bit of work, where the lower body and the core tend to be bypassed a bit. So what's important is that in an efficient mechanism, and when you look at your highest level athletes, the lower body is our horsepower and drives this process. The core is our differential, and turns that horsepower into something. It turns it into rotational speed, if you will. And the upper body is along for the ride. The upper body doesn't do the work, but benefits from the work. And that's a really, really important part of understanding this mechanism, both from an analysis, evaluation perspective, as well as a training perspective. So when we look at the biomechanics today, we are going to be focused on the upper body movements with respect to the anatomy and the biomechanics of it, as we've discussed, but also from a primary driver's perspective, in that the upper body benefits from the lower body and the core movement and doesn't do work, but accepts work and is part of the outcome. Okay. So now let's talk just a little bit about the dynamics here. So what we can look at is as we accelerate the bat. So here's the end of the bat here. The arms are going through this D1, D2 pattern, this diagonal pattern. It's fairly complex anatomically and neuromechanically, but from an outcome perspective, it's fairly simplistic. We've got our spine orientation, and then we've got essentially the top of the spine where the shoulder, between the two shoulders, joint centers, right down to where the wrists are where the hands are gripping the bat. So we can create a body segment, sort of an imaginary body segment, that is a function of both shoulders and both arms, elbows, and forearms going through their D1, D2 patterns, producing essentially movement where the wrists are, or where the hands grip the bat. The bat becomes the secondary part of this mechanism, in that as the arms accelerate, they will then decelerate, creating essentially sort of this jackknife effect, where the bat or the implement itself is being flung away from the extremities. So the arms will be accelerated off of the lower body work, off of the core work, will be accelerated to a point where they then decelerate. As they decelerate, the bat will accelerate. Now, that's the fling action. That's the action of, imagine yourself driving in a car, you accelerate from 0 to 60 as fast as you can, pedal to the floor, and then you basically slam on the brakes as hard as you can, and whatever's in the front seat, you got your groceries, you got your briefcase, whatever's in the front seat just goes flying. And that's the fling. So you've got so now you've got your acceleration and you've got your fling. The arms to bat mechanism is again fairly complex when you look at it anatomically, but fairly simplistic when you look at it just from an energy or a movement perspective. A fairly straightforward event. Now, the arms decelerate, but they do not stop. So a lot of times when you talk about the arms decelerating, the picture people conjure up is somehow the arms stopping. The arms do not stop. They go from going really fast to going not quite as fast. And they do that in a very short period of time. So it's a very rapid deceleration, but it's not like the arms stop. In fact, to the human eye, it's almost imperceivable. To an analysis program like Xenolink, you can actually measure a very significant deceleration. Now remember, the deceleration is occurring over the course of milliseconds. It's not something that you're going to see visually, but it has a dramatic impact on the mechanism itself, and is a very, very important part of accelerating the bat efficiently and effectively. So your highest level athletes will use their legs to drive the power process, will use their core to turn that power into motion, rotational speed, and then will drive the arms without forcing the activity to a peak output, followed by a deceleration process which allows the bat to fling or accelerate away from the arms. And this is true not only of hitting, baseball swing, but pretty much of every swing type pattern. And a swing type pattern being defined as both hands on the implement itself. Okay. So when we get into a training program, there are two things that we're going to want to focus on. One is the arm pattern, the D1, D2 pattern that we've just been discussing anatomically. creating an effective pattern there and creating an efficient use of the lower body of the core to drive that pattern. Secondly, we are talking about bracing, which is sort of a hyper stiffening that happens very, very quickly over the course of fractions of a second and allows the back to be flung. So bracing facilitates the flinging pattern. So we're going to look at two key areas when we develop our training program. One is arm pattern, the other is a bracing, okay, or super stiffening. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to quickly cover what I would suggest in terms of some basic upper body program, adding a little bit more involved type stuff, and then ultimately adding in some additional exercises, some condition-wise. I'm going to talk about this real quick, and then I'm going to move to recording this. Now, last time I did this, I believe I lost the audio. So when I shift gears here in a few minutes, I'll wait a second. You can tell me if you still have audio when I shift and turn on the video and shut down the recording here and turn on the recording on the other video. So really quick, what we're going to want to do is we're going to look at sitting upper body separation. This is just learning to use the upper thoracic, the upper torso as an anchor for upper extremity movement. We'll start with the lead arm first, and then we can always add the trail arm. We do that sitting first, and then we can add in a standing variation of that. We will look at performing a modified chop pattern, which is essentially that D1, D2 pattern that I showed you with the med ball, except we'll be using a baseball bat, and we won't be squatting. We will then add a towel snap into the mix, which will emphasize the brace component, and then we'll finish up with some basic full swings, but with lower body isolation and collision with an impact back. And I'll show you all that visually here shortly. Now, ways that we can add in some more dynamic stuff. If we wanted to, we could add in a dynamic upper body warm-up. Dynamic torso rotation is a very straightforward exercise, basically rotating from side to side. Now I'm going to show all this here in a second, but just to kind of quickly cover it. Overhead side reach, again, very simplistic. We do it dynamically, reaching up, reaching over, down, around, and up, and we can change direction. Arm crossovers, very simple. Pull aparts and prayers, mostly engaging shoulders and scapula so that we can warm the joints and warm the movements. And then when we get into our PST, we can modify just a little bit where we can say for example, we can do the movement stuff where we look at sitting, standing, and modified chops, and then do our full swings. Then we can do modified chops with full swings and then some plyometrics. So we can sort of group and advance our PST a little bit if we want to get a little bit more advanced about the program itself. And the last thing we can do is there are ways that we can add PNF extremity movements, especially D2, but D1 as well, D1 being the upward movement, D2 being the downward movement. We can add in variations of a med ball chop as a function of this. We can also add med ball chest passing and rotational chest passing with sort of a modified D2 pattern. This would emphasize the bracing component. And then we can also add in exercises like the push jerk or push press or kettlebell swings, also very much employing and emphasizing lower body drive, core control, and extremity acceleration. In other words, benefiting from the lower body and the core work. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to turn on my video. That'll take a second. I'm going to stop the recording here in a second. And if for some reason my audio is lost, hold on a second. So I'm turning on the video. I'm going to hold on here. Just boot up the video. If the audio drops, let me know. I'm not sure I can do anything about it. What I did last time is the other video camera has audio, and I'm posting both sections. So the audio for the lecture should have been fine. If I drop it when I engage this, let me know. Just chat me a message if you're having a problem hearing me. I'm going to, at this time, turn off the recording.